Hey there, Jacob Bock, greeting you from the valley, from the desert, Phoenix, Arizona. Oh, by the way, if you're going to go to the desert in Arizona, don't wear black. Man, it's hot out here. You know, a few weeks ago, I recorded a video blog about a spiritual retreat. And you know, we all want to live in the mountaintop. We all want to have the spiritual retreat. We all want to live in personal revival. We all want to be hot for God. But you know, the truth of the matter is, that's not really where we live. There's times that we have that mountaintop experience where we're, you know, drinking in from God. Remember that time I talked about the spiritual retreat and I went up to Sweden and I buried myself into a log cabin for about 10 days, a time of prayer and fasting, and you know, your spiritual eyesight becomes clear and you prevail with God, and you wake up in the morning and you don't have a cell phone, you don't have a computer, you don't have the news, and you just go for walks with God. And I mean, everything is just great. You know, you get back from a spiritual retreat like that and you're kind of living in this zone. You know, pastors come up to you and they say, oh, come and preach for me, because they just know that you've been on the mountaintop. But you know, the mountaintop is not where we live our lives. And I was remembering back about 6 years ago when we were doing the deal at Kilometer Zero, and I just love the way the wind is blowing this screen. That is really special. Are you getting sick just watching this thing? When we were doing this Kilometer Zero Prayer and Evangelism Center, and I remember standing out on the town square, and I was looking out at the group of people that was passing through there, and I said, oh God, if we just had a place. And I remember at that moment, I started having a moment. I started having a mountaintop experience where God said, do you want me to give you the Puerta del Sol so you can go out at any time you want and just preach, and I'm going to do a work here, and I want to invite you to be a part of it. You know, that moment lasted about 2 weeks, and I felt like I was just floating, and I mean, God was speaking, everything was clear. But you know, you come down from that, and that doesn't mean I don't live in personal revival. That doesn't mean that I'm not on fire for God. It just means that we live in the kind of the gray area of life. You know, Oswald Chambers said something that really spoke to me. I was reading it in the utmost for his highest. He says, never allow a feeling which was stirred in you on the high hour to evaporate. And he says that we have to learn to live in the gray day according to what we saw on the mountain. And you know, just about everything that we do is lived in the gray day. We don't live on the mountaintop. A lot of you have seen C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. Well, in the Silver Chair, there's an interesting quote that Aslan gives to Lucy up on the mountain. And this is what he says. He says, here on the mountain I have spoken to you clearly. I will not often do so down in Narnia. Here on the mountain, the air is clear and your mind is clear. But as you drop down into Narnia, the air will thicken. Take great care that it does not confuse your mind. And you know, our lives are not lived on the mountaintop. And so this is what I want to encourage you. You know, when we live in the desert, we live in the valley. That's where we live our lives. You know, when Peter, James, and John, the threesome, they went up to the Mount of Transfiguration, you know, they had this great mountaintop experience with Jesus. You know, he got all white and glowing, and Peter pipes up, says, man, let's build a church here. You know, let's stay up here. This is really cool. And Jesus said, no, let's go down into the valley, because there were the disciples. Where were they? They were down in the valley, and they were like pulling out their hair, trying to cast out this demon. It just wouldn't go out. And they had to get down into the valley to be able to put into practice the power of God. The power of God that they had received on the mountaintop. So you and I live our lives in the desert. We live our lives in the gray area. We live our lives in the valley. And from time to time, and not usually when we choose, but from time to time, God allows us to get up onto the mountaintop, and he allows us to get refreshed, and he allows us to see clearly. And we just got to make sure that we don't allow that to evaporate, so that when we get down into the marketplace and into our jobs, to the workplace, onto the streets, at the supermarkets, into that gray area, we can still be powerful for God. You know, I realized that most of life is not lived up there on the mountaintop. Most of life is lived right down here in the desert.